30 gold prospectors vanished near Blackwater mining camp in just 6 months. Every single one carried thousands in gold dust when they disappeared. The Brennan family running the camp wasn't mining for gold at all. They were harvesting something far more valuable: human bodies for medical schools across America. Before we dive into the story, if you love shocking true crime stories that expose the darkest corners of history, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another incredible tale tomorrow. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. We love connecting with our global community of history lovers. Now let's continue with the story. The Idaho Territory in 1886 was supposed to be a land of opportunity, where men could strike it rich with nothing but determination and a pickaxe. But something sinister was happening in the remote mountains near Blackwater Creek that would shock even the hardened lawmen of the Wild West. Marshal James Crawford had investigated missing persons before, but when the territorial governor handed him a stack of 30 missing person reports, all from the same remote area over just 6 months, he knew this was different from anything he'd encountered in his 20 years of law enforcement. Each missing prospector shared disturbing similarities that made Crawford's blood run cold as he studied the reports in his dimly lit office. They were all experienced miners who had already struck it rich elsewhere, carrying between $2,000 and $5,000 in gold dust when they vanished, and every single one had mentioned visiting the Blackwater mining camp run by the Brennan family before disappearing forever. The pattern was too perfect to be coincidence, and Crawford realized he was looking at something far more calculated than random violence or claim jumping that plagued other mining territories. The last known victim was William Fletcher, a successful 42-year-old prospector from Sacramento who had written to his wife just days before vanishing, describing the Brennan family's incredible hospitality and their generous offer to let him buy shares in what they claimed was the richest gold vein in all of Idaho. Fletcher's letter painted a picture of the perfect mining operation, with state-of-the-art equipment, productive shafts, and a family that seemed to have mastered the art of extracting gold from the stubborn Idaho mountains. But his enthusiasm would be the last thing his wife ever heard from him. What made the disappearances even more chilling was that none of the missing men's equipment, horses, or personal effects had ever surfaced in any of the nearby towns where stolen goods typically appeared, as if the earth had simply swallowed them whole along with everything they owned. Crawford knew that 30 men don't just vanish without leaving some trace, and the complete absence of evidence suggested a level of planning and execution that went far beyond typical frontier crime, pointing to something systematic and horrifyingly efficient operating in those isolated mountains. The story of how the Brennan family came to Idaho Territory begins 5 years earlier in 1881, when a weathered wagon carrying 6 Irish immigrants rolled into the tiny settlement of Silver Creek, bringing with them secrets that would eventually turn the frontier into a killing field. Seamus Brennan was a giant of a man at 6'4", with arms like tree trunks and eyes that never seemed to blink, while his wife Moira moved with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to survive by never drawing attention to herself. Their 4 adult children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, all in their 20s, shared their father's imposing build and their mother's unsettling stillness, creating a family that locals immediately recognized as different from the usual fortune seekers flooding into Idaho. The Brennans claimed to have come from the coal mines of Pennsylvania, where Seamus said he'd saved enough money to pursue his dream of gold prospecting. But something about their story never quite added up to those who bothered to pay attention. They spoke of mining experience, but their hands lacked the telltale scars of coal work, and while they claimed poverty had driven them west, they paid for their supplies with crisp bills that seemed too new for a working family's savings. Most suspicious of all was their complete lack of interest in joining other prospectors or sharing information about mining techniques, as if they already knew exactly what they were doing and wanted no outside interference. Within weeks of arriving, Seamus announced to anyone who would listen that he'd discovered promising signs of gold in the remote mountains near Blackwater Creek, an area most prospectors avoided due to its isolation and the treacherous paths required to reach it. He filed his claims properly with the territorial office, paying the fees in full without haggling, and began purchasing mining equipment with a confidence that suggested he knew exactly what he was looking for and where to find it. The family moved their entire operation to the mountains, building a substantial compound that grew more elaborate with each passing month, funded by gold they claimed to be pulling from their secret mine. What truly set the Brennans apart from other mining families was their absolute refusal to sell their gold through normal channels, never once appearing at the assay offices or banks where successful miners typically converted their dust to cash. Instead, they made irregular trips to distant cities like San Francisco and Chicago, returning with supplies and equipment, but never explaining how they'd sold their gold or why they traveled so far to do it. Local merchants noticed that the Brennans always paid in different currency, sometimes California gold certificates, sometimes Chicago bank notes, never the same source twice, as if they were deliberately obscuring their financial trails. The isolation of their Blackwater camp became legendary among local prospectors, with stories of armed guards, vicious dogs, and warning shots fired at anyone who ventured too close without invitation. Yet paradoxically, the family would occasionally invite select individuals to visit their operation. These invitations always went to successful prospectors who had already made significant strikes, men with money to invest and dreams of even greater riches, and the Brennans would charm them with tales of the massive vein they discovered but couldn't fully exploit without additional capital and partners. The Brennan family had turned deception into an art form, transforming their isolated mountain location into the most irresistible honey trap in the American West, and they did it with a sophistication that would have impressed the best confidence men of the era. They understood that successful prospectors were naturally suspicious people who had survived by trusting no one. So instead of approaching their victims directly, they let rumors do the hunting for them. The family would send different members into nearby towns on carefully timed visits, each one dropping hints about their incredible success while maintaining just enough secrecy to make their claims seem genuine rather than boastful. Moira Brennan proved especially gifted at this psychological manipulation, frequenting the general stores where miners' wives gathered and speaking in hushed tones about her fears that claim jumpers might discover their secret, while occasionally letting slip details about the pure quality of their gold and the seemingly endless vein they'd discovered. She would purchase expensive items with visible reluctance, sighing about how Seamus insisted on the best equipment but worried it might draw unwanted attention, a performance that made other women sympathize with her while secretly envying her husband's success. These calculated appearances created a narrative that spread through mining communities like wildfire, establishing the Brennans as lucky strikers who were trying desperately to keep their fortune quiet. The physical setup of the Blackwater camp itself was a masterpiece of illusion that convinced even experienced miners they were witnessing a legitimate operation of extraordinary success. The Brennans had invested heavily in authentic mining equipment, including steam-powered pumps, professional-grade sluice boxes, and industrial crushing machines that would have cost a fortune, creating the appearance of a serious operation that was extracting massive amounts of ore. They maintained multiple mine shafts that appeared to descend deep into the mountain, complete with timber supports and cart tracks, though investigators would later discover these tunnels led nowhere and existed solely to convince visitors of the mine's legitimacy. When a prospector expressed interest in potentially investing in the Blackwater operation, the Brennans would orchestrate an elaborate performance that began the moment their guest arrived at the camp's perimeter. The visitor would be met by armed guards who would scrutinize their credentials with theatrical suspicion before reluctantly allowing them to proceed, reinforcing the idea that something incredibly valuable was being protected. The family would then guide their guest through a carefully choreographed tour, showing them buckets of gold-bearing or they claim to have just extracted, even allowing them to pan some material in the creek where gold dust had been deliberately seeded to guarantee exciting results. The genius of their trap lay in how they made their victims feel like they were the ones pushing for a deal, rather than being sold something, as the Brennans would express reluctance about taking on partners and worry aloud about trusting outsiders with their secret. They would require potential investors to prove their seriousness by bringing substantial capital in gold dust or cash, explaining that paper certificates or promises meant nothing in the wilderness, and that any partnership had to be based on immediate, tangible resources. This requirement seemed entirely reasonable to prospectors who understood that frontier business operated on different rules than city commerce, and it ensured that every victim arrived at the camp carrying everything the Brennans wanted to steal. The Brennans approached murder with the same methodical planning that legitimate businesses used for their operations, developing a systematic process for identifying and evaluating potential victims that would have impressed even the most calculating criminal minds of the era. Seamus had assigned each family member specific roles in their deadly enterprise, with his eldest son Patrick serving as the scout who frequented saloons and mining camps to identify prospectors who had recently made significant strikes, while his daughter Margaret worked in town as a seamstress where she gathered gossip about which miners were planning to sell their claims or move on to new territories. Every piece of information was carefully recorded in a ledger that Moira maintained, creating detailed profiles of potential targets that included their assets, their family situations, and most importantly, how likely their disappearances were to trigger serious investigations. The family had learned through careful observation that the perfect victims were successful enough to be worth killing, but isolated enough that their deaths wouldn't cause immediate alarm, targeting men who were passing through the territory rather than established locals with strong community ties. They preferred prospectors who had already announced plans to move on to new gold fields, men whose disappearances could be easily explained as simply heading to California or Montana without saying goodbye, and they were particularly drawn to foreign immigrants who had no family in America to report them missing. The Brennans discovered that men carrying between $3,000 and $5,000 in gold dust represented the sweet spot of their operation, wealthy enough to make the risk worthwhile, but not so rich that their disappearance would draw attention from banks or mining companies. What separated the Brennans from common murderers was their understanding that each killing had to be an investment that paid dividends beyond the immediate theft of gold and equipment, which led them to discover an entirely different revenue stream that would transform their operation. During a trip to Chicago in 1883, Seamus had learned through underground channels that medical schools were desperate for human cadavers to use in anatomy classes, paying premium prices for fresh bodies with no questions asked about their origins. The legitimate supply of corpses for medical education was severely limited by law, creating a black market where body snatchers could earn more from a single corpse than most miners made in a month of hard labor. The family refined their selection criteria to prioritize victims whose bodies would be most valuable to medical schools, focusing on younger, healthier men whose corpses would provide better anatomical specimens for student instruction. They avoided killing anyone with visible diseases or deformities that might reduce the body's value, and they became experts at preserving corpses using techniques they learned from medical texts, including chemical injection methods that would keep bodies fresh during the long journey to urban medical schools. This dual revenue stream meant that each victim provided immediate profit from their gold and possessions, followed by additional income from selling their remains to anatomy departments, creating a horrifyingly efficient business model. The Brennans maintained detailed correspondence with their medical contacts using false names and mail forwarding services, building a reputation as reliable suppliers who could provide fresh specimens on a regular schedule without the risks associated with grave robbing or stealing bodies from poorhouses. They commanded premium prices by guaranteeing the quality and condition of their specimens, even offering specific types of corpses on request, such as younger men for surgical instruction or older subjects for pathology studies, treating human beings like items in a macabre catalog. William Fletcher arrived at the Blackwater mining camp on a crisp October morning in 1886, carrying $3,000 in gold dust and the dreams of doubling his fortune through what he believed would be the investment opportunity of a lifetime. The 42-year-old prospector from Sacramento had spent weeks corresponding with the Brennans about purchasing shares in their operation, and as his horse climbed the treacherous mountain path, he felt the familiar excitement that came with a promising venture. The guards who met him at the camp's perimeter examined his credentials with impressive thoroughness before sending word to the main compound, making Fletcher wait just long enough to build anticipation before Seamus Brennan himself emerged to welcome him with a hearty handshake and warm Irish hospitality. The tour that followed was a masterpiece of deception that had been perfected through dozens of previous performances, with each family member playing their role with the precision of seasoned actors in a deadly play. Patrick Brennan led Fletcher to the main shaft, where the sound of machinery echoed from deep below and workers could be seen hauling up buckets of or that glittered with visible gold deposits, though Fletcher would never know these were the same buckets of salted or the family had been using for months. Margaret Brennan appeared from the equipment shed with samples of processed gold that she claimed had been extracted just that morning, allowing Fletcher to hold the heavy nuggets in his hands while she explained the revolutionary crushing technique her father had developed that extracted twice as much gold as traditional methods. The family had learned that the key to maintaining their victims' trust was to never appear too eager for the investment. So when Fletcher expressed his readiness to become a partner, Seamus expressed concern about bringing in an outsider and suggested they spend the evening discussing the arrangement over dinner. The meal that followed was elaborate and convivial, with Moira serving a feast of fresh venison and vegetables while the family shared stories of their mining adventures and asked Fletcher about his own experiences in the gold fields, creating an atmosphere of warmth and camaraderie that made him feel like he was joining a family rather than just making a business deal. The youngest son, Michael, played fiddle while Margaret sang Irish ballads, and Fletcher found himself relaxing completely, accepting glass after glass of whiskey that Seamus kept pouring with generous hospitality. As the evening wore on and Fletcher's judgment became clouded by alcohol and exhaustion from his long journey, the conversation turned to the specifics of the partnership agreement, with Seamus producing an impressively official-looking contract that outlined Fletcher's 25% stake in the mine's future profits. The prospector barely hesitated before signing, too intoxicated to notice the peculiar clause about his share being void if he abandoned the claim without notice, and he cheerfully handed over his bags of gold dust while Seamus counted it carefully and provided a receipt that would never be found. Fletcher was shown to a comfortable cabin near the main house, where he collapsed into bed fully clothed, already planning the letter he would write to his wife about their newfound fortune. The prospector never woke up from that sleep, as sometime during the night, Patrick Brennan entered the cabin and administered a precise dose of chloroform that transformed Fletcher's drunken slumber into permanent unconsciousness before a pillow over his face finished the job without leaving marks that might damage the value of his corpse. By dawn, Fletcher's body had been stripped, washed, and injected with preservative chemicals while his possessions were sorted into piles for disposal or resale, and within hours, he had become just another product in the Brennans' grotesque inventory, ready for shipment to a medical school that had already paid in advance for a fresh specimen. Marshal James Crawford's investigation into the missing prospectors led him to the Blackwater mining camp on a foggy morning in November 1886, accompanied by 6 armed deputies who shared his growing suspicion that something far worse than claim jumping was happening in these isolated mountains. The journey to the camp had taken 3 days through increasingly desolate terrain, and Crawford noticed how even the wildlife seemed to avoid the area around Blackwater Creek, creating an unnatural silence that made his deputies grip their rifles tighter with each passing mile. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking the Brennan compound, Crawford was struck by how substantial the operation appeared, with multiple buildings, equipment sheds, and what looked like a thriving mining enterprise. Yet something about the scene felt fundamentally wrong in a way he couldn't immediately identify. The absence of any guards to challenge their approach was the first sign that the Brennans had somehow learned of the investigation and fled, leaving behind their elaborate compound like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Crawford and his men spread out through the camp with weapons drawn, calling out for anyone present to show themselves, but only their own echoes answered back from the mountain walls. The main house was luxuriously furnished with items that seemed impossibly expensive for a frontier mining family, including crystal chandeliers, Persian rugs, and a piano that must have cost a fortune to transport into these mountains. Yet everything had been abandoned as if the family had vanished in the middle of an ordinary day. It was Deputy Morrison who made the first horrifying discovery when he investigated what appeared to be a storage shed behind the main house, only to stumble backward gagging at the overwhelming smell of chemicals that reminded him of the Undertaker's parlor back in Boise. Inside, Crawford found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life, with rows of metal tables equipped with drainage channels, surgical instruments arranged on shelves like a hospital operating room, and massive glass jars filled with preservation fluid. The walls were lined with medical textbooks and anatomical charts, while a desk contained detailed records of shipments to addresses in Chicago, New York, Boston, and San Francisco, all marked with coded references that Crawford was beginning to understand with growing horror. The true scope of the Brennan's operation became clear when Crawford discovered the ice house, which had been converted into a massive refrigeration facility using techniques he'd never seen outside of major city morgues. Inside were lead-lined boxes packed with salt and chemicals, each one sized perfectly to hold a human body, with shipping labels ready to be attached for rail transport to medical schools across the country. A logbook on the wall contained entries dating back 5 years, recording the processing of what Crawford realized were the missing prospectors, each one reduced to a commodity with notes about their physical condition, age, and the price received for their corpses from medical institutions that believed they were purchasing legally obtained anatomical specimens. The investigation of the mine shafts revealed the final piece of the horrific puzzle when Crawford's men discovered that the impressive tunnels they'd seen from above were elaborate facades that extended only 20 or 30 feet into the mountain before ending in solid rock. There was no gold mine and never had been, with the entire operation existing solely as bait to lure wealthy prospectors to their deaths, while the real business was harvesting human bodies for an insatiable medical education industry that asked no questions about where their specimens originated. The scattered mining equipment and/or samples were all props in an elaborate theatrical production designed to convince victims they were investing in a fortune when they were actually walking into a slaughterhouse that had been operating for half a decade. The web of connections between the Brennan family and America's most prestigious medical institutions was so extensive that Marshall Crawford initially refused to believe what the evidence was telling him. Yet the meticulous records left behind painted an undeniable picture of a nationwide corpse trafficking network. The family had been shipping bodies to over 20 medical schools across the country, using a complex system of false names, forwarding addresses, and intermediate handlers who believed they were part of a legitimate anatomical supply company. Letters found in Seamus Brennan's desk revealed correspondence with prominent professors of anatomy who praised the quality of the specimens and regularly placed orders for specific types of cadavers, treating the transaction like any other academic supply purchase. The medical schools purchasing these bodies included some of the most respected institutions in America, whose anatomy departments were training the next generation of doctors using the corpses of murdered prospectors without any knowledge of their true origins. The Brennans had presented themselves as professional body procurers who obtained specimens through legal channels, such as claiming unclaimed bodies from poorhouses or purchasing corpses from families too poor to afford burial, a common practice that operated in a legal gray area that nobody wanted to examine too closely. The prices paid were staggering, with fresh adult male specimens commanding between $200 and $500 depending on their condition, making each body worth more than most Americans earned in a year of honest labor. Professor Harold Whitman of the Chicago Medical College had been one of the Brennans' best customers, ordering dozens of specimens over the years for his renowned anatomy program that attracted students from across the Midwest. His letters to the family, addressed to their alias, Morrison Medical Supplies, expressed gratitude for the consistent quality and preservation of the corpses, even noting how the specimens seemed healthier and more robust than typical poorhouse bodies. Whitman had recommended the Brennan's services to colleagues at other institutions, unknowingly helping to expand a murder operation that was hiding behind the desperate needs of medical education. And his endorsements carried such weight that few questioned the source of these exceptional anatomical specimens. The distribution network the Brennans had created was remarkably sophisticated, using refrigerated railroad cars typically reserved for meat-packing companies to transport bodies across the country without arousing suspicion. They had established relationships with freight handlers who were paid to look the other way when loading unmarked crates, and they timed shipments to coincide with the beginning of medical school terms when demand for cadavers was highest. The family had even developed a coding system in their correspondence, referring to bodies as materials or specimens, with different codes indicating age ranges and physical conditions, allowing medical schools to order exactly what they needed for specific instructional purposes. What made the network particularly insidious was how it exploited the genuine crisis in medical education that existed in 1880s America, when legitimate sources of cadavers were so scarce that many medical schools couldn't provide adequate anatomical instruction to their students. Laws governing the use of human bodies for dissection were restrictive and varied wildly between states, creating a situation where even prestigious institutions were forced to operate in legal gray areas to obtain the specimens necessary for training competent physicians. The Brennans had positioned themselves as problem solvers for desperate anatomy professors who needed bodies to teach future doctors how to save lives, never revealing that each specimen represented a life deliberately taken for profit. The efficiency of the Brennan family's corpse processing operation was so horrifyingly professional that even hardened frontier lawmen struggled to comprehend how human beings could approach murder with such clinical detachment. Each family member had developed specialized skills that would have been valuable in legitimate medical fields, with Moira Brennan demonstrating knowledge of preservation techniques that rivaled university-trained embalmers, while her children had learned to prepare bodies with the precision of surgical assistants. The shed behind their compound contained equipment that Crawford recognized from visits to city morgues, including arterial injection pumps, trocar needles for cavity drainage, and an extensive collection of preservation chemicals that must have cost a fortune to acquire and transport to this remote location. The process began immediately after each murder, with the body being moved to the preparation shed while still warm, as the Brennans had learned that preservation worked best when started before rigor mortis set in. Patrick Brennan's role was to strip and wash the corpses, examining them for any identifying marks, scars, or tattoos that might compromise their value or lead to identification, meticulously documenting each body's physical characteristics in a ledger that read like a livestock inventory. The family had developed a rating system for corpses based on age, physical condition, and preservation quality, with premium prices charged for younger specimens in perfect condition, while older or damaged bodies were sold at discount rates to less prestigious institutions. Margaret Brennan had become an expert in arterial injection, using a hand-operated pump to force preservation fluid through the circulatory system, replacing blood with a mixture of formaldehyde, alcohol, and glycerin that would keep tissues from decomposing during shipment. She had learned to adjust the chemical mixture based on how long the body would be in transit, adding more formaldehyde for cross-country shipments while using gentler preservatives for specimens going to nearby cities. The attention to detail was extraordinary, with injection sites carefully hidden and bodies positioned to maintain a natural appearance that wouldn't disturb medical students who might already be squeamish about dissecting human remains. The younger son Michael had mastered the art of packaging corpses for shipment, using lead-lined wooden crates packed with sawdust, salt, and ice to maintain optimal preservation during transport across America's expanding railroad network. He had learned to forge shipping documents that identified the contents as educational materials or medical supplies, using legitimate medical supply company names as covers for their deadly cargo. The crates were built to standard dimensions that wouldn't attract attention at freight depots, and Michael had developed relationships with railroad workers who were paid to ensure the shipments received priority handling to minimize transit time. What truly revealed the industrial scale of their operation was the discovery of the family's disposal system for parts that couldn't be sold or shipped. With a lime pit behind the compound containing the dissolved remains of victims whose bodies had been damaged during killing or whose preservation had failed, Crawford's investigation revealed that the Brennans had processed at least one body per week for the past 5 years, turning murder into a grotesque assembly line that operated with the same efficiency as the Chicago stockyards, except instead of processing cattle for consumption, they were harvesting human beings for medical education. The technical expertise required for such an operation suggested that at least one family member had received formal medical training, leading Crawford to suspect that Seamus Brennan might have been a medical student himself before discovering that selling corpses was more profitable than practicing medicine. Marshall Crawford's growing horror reached new depths as he decoded the Brennans' shipping records, revealing that respected medical institutions across America had been teaching future doctors using the bodies of murdered prospectors for nearly 5 years. The family's ledgers contained detailed records of over 200 shipments to medical schools in Chicago, New York, Boston, San Francisco, and Philadelphia, each entry representing a human life taken for profit and transformed into an anatomical specimen. Crawford realized he was holding evidence of one of the most extensive serial murder operations in American history, yet the implications went far beyond simple homicide, touching the very foundations of medical education in the United States. The Marshal spent sleepless nights cross-referencing the shipping dates with his missing persons reports, slowly matching coded entries to real names and faces of men who had vanished while seeking their fortunes in the Idaho mountains. William Fletcher's name appeared as specimen 247, male, 42 years, excellent condition, premium grade, shipped to Harvard Medical School just 3 days after his disappearance, while Thomas Anderson became material 189, male, 38 years, good musculature, suitable for surgical instruction, sent to the University of Pennsylvania. Each match Crawford made represented not just a murder solved, but a family somewhere who would finally learn what had happened to their missing loved one, though the truth would be more horrible than anything they had imagined. The investigation took an even darker turn when Crawford discovered correspondence suggesting that some medical professors had begun to suspect something was wrong with their supply chain, but had chosen to look the other way rather than risk losing access to high-quality specimens. One letter from a professor at Columbia Medical College noted that the specimens from Morrison Medical Supplies seemed unusually fresh and well-preserved compared to typical poorhouse bodies, wondering in writing whether the company had access to executed criminals. Yet he continued ordering bodies despite his suspicions. Another professor in Boston had questioned why all the specimens were healthy adult males with no signs of disease or long-term illness, unusual for bodies supposedly coming from charity hospitals. But his concerns hadn't stopped him from purchasing 17 corpses over 2 years. Crawford's decision to contact the medical schools directly created a panic in academic circles as anatomy professors realized they had been unknowingly complicit in mass murder, with some institutions immediately suspending their anatomy programs, while others tried to quietly dispose of any remaining specimens that might have come from the Brennans. The telegram Crawford sent to the dean of Chicago Medical College caused such distress that the elderly administrator suffered a heart attack upon learning that his prestigious institution had been teaching students using murder victims, while Harvard Medical School launched an internal investigation that would ultimately lead to the resignation of 3 professors who had approved the purchases. The scope of the investigation expanded when Crawford discovered that the Brennans had maintained detailed records of which specific bodies went to which institutions, meaning that medical schools would be able to identify exactly which of their specimens were murder victims. This revelation was particularly disturbing for recent medical graduates who realized they had learned their craft by dissecting innocent men who had been killed specifically to provide their bodies for education, with some young doctors suffering psychological breakdowns when they understood the true nature of their training. The investigation files grew to fill entire filing cabinets as Crawford methodically built cases that would not only pursue the Brennan family for murder, but would also expose how America's medical establishment had created a demand for human bodies so desperate that it had inadvertently funded and encouraged mass murder. The capture of the Brennan family came 3 weeks after the discovery of their compound, when a telegraph operator in Portland recognized Seamus from a wanted poster and alerted authorities that the family was attempting to book passage on a ship bound for Australia. The arrest at the Portland docks turned into a violent confrontation when Patrick Brennan pulled a concealed pistol and wounded 2 police officers before being shot down, dying in the same clinical manner he had dispatched so many victims, while the rest of the family surrendered without further resistance. As Crawford arrived to take custody of the prisoners, he was struck by how ordinary they appeared. Just another immigrant family trying to make their way in America, giving no outward sign of the monstrous crimes they had committed in those isolated Idaho mountains. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational cases in American legal history, with newspapers across the country covering every detail of what they called the anatomical murders, while medical schools desperately tried to distance themselves from the scandal. Seamus Brennan shocked the courtroom by showing no remorse whatsoever, arguing that he had simply been meeting a market demand and that the medical schools were equally guilty for creating a system that required human bodies but refused to ask where they came from. His testimony revealed that he had indeed been a medical student in Dublin before immigrating to America, where he had learned about the desperate shortage of cadavers and recognized what he called a business opportunity that combined his medical knowledge with his complete absence of moral restraint. Moira Brennan's testimony provided the most chilling insights into the family's psychology, as she calmly explained how they had viewed their victims not as human beings, but as livestock to be harvested, comparing their operation to the meat packing plants of Chicago that turned living animals into profitable products. She revealed that the family had killed at least 300 men over 5 years, far more than Crawford's investigation had uncovered, with many early victims buried in unmarked graves before they had perfected their preservation and shipping techniques. Her matter-of-fact description of murdering men who had trusted them enough to share meals and conversation just hours before their deaths demonstrated a level of psychological detachment that expert witnesses struggled to explain or categorize. The executions of Seamus, Moira, and Margaret Brennan took place on a gray December morning in 1887, with Michael receiving life imprisonment due to his younger age and claims that he had been forced to participate by his parents. The hangings were attended by relatives of victims who had traveled from across the country to witness justice, though many reported feeling no satisfaction from watching the Brennans die, as nothing could bring back their murdered loved ones or erase the horror of knowing how they had died. The medical schools implicated in the scandal faced massive lawsuits from victims' families, with several institutions paying substantial settlements while implementing strict new protocols for verifying the sources of anatomical specimens. The lasting impact of the Brennan case extended far beyond the immediate tragedy, fundamentally changing how America approached medical education and the procurement of human bodies for anatomical study. New federal legislation established strict guidelines for obtaining cadavers, creating legal donation programs and requiring extensive documentation for any body used in medical education, while medical schools instituted ethics courses that used the Brennan case as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing educational needs over human dignity. The case remains a dark chapter in American medical history, reminding us that the pursuit of knowledge and progress can never justify the taking of human life, and that even the most noble goals can become corrupted when we forget that every corpse in an anatomy lab was once a person with dreams, hopes, and the right to die with dignity rather than being reduced to an educational commodity. If this dark chapter of American history shocked you as much as it did those who lived through it, please click the like button and subscribe to our channel, because tomorrow we're uncovering another suppressed story from history that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the past. The truth is waiting for you. Don't let it slip away into the shadows of forgotten history.